The name sounds almost respectable. A gong farmer has a rustic, earthy feel to it. You might picture a man working a field growing some kind of sturdy crop, but the truth is much darker. The word gong comes from an old English word gong, which meant to go. It became the word for a privy, or a toilet, a place you go, and later it came to mean the stuff that collected in that place. The filth, the human waste. A gong farmer did not sow seeds. He did not raise livestock. He harvested human excrement. He was a medieval cleaner of toilets, but that description doesn't do the job justice. It sanitizes something that was anything but sanitary. We live in a world of flush toilets and hidden sewer systems. We never have to think about where it all goes. In a medieval city, everyone knew where it went. Here, it went into a hole in the ground, a cesspit. These pits were dug beneath houses, castles, and monasteries. They were lined with stone or brick, if you were lucky. Most were just holes in the earth. Day after day, year after year, everything from the privy above dropped into this dark, contained space. It was a simple solution for a while, but cities were growing. Places like London were getting crowded. More people meant more waste, and the pits were filling up. An overflowing cesspit wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disaster. The stench was the first warning, a foul, suffocating smell that would seep up through the floorboards of the house. It would poison the air in the yard, it would offend the neighbors. In the summer heat, the smell could become unbearable, a physical presence that clung to everything. But the smell was the least of the problems. The filth would begin to leak. It could ooze through the stone walls of the cesspit and into the cellar of the house. It could contaminate the well water, the same water the family drank and cooked with. This was a death sentence. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. These diseases spread through contaminated water. An overflowing cesspit could poison a whole neighborhood. It was a public health crisis waiting to happen. So the pit had to be emptied, and that is where the gong farmer came in. This was not a job for just anyone. It was the lowest of the low, a job so foul, so disgusting that most people would rather starve than do it. But it was essential. Without the gong farmer, the city would have choked on its own filth. He was the unseen gear in the machine of urban life. He did the work that allowed everyone else to live in some semblance of cleanliness. The work was regulated. You couldn't just be a gong farmer. You had to be hired. And you could only work at night. The city authorities decreed it. The work was too offensive to be done in daylight. The sight and the smell were not for polite society. So the gong farmer became a creature of the night. He and his crew would arrive with their cart and tools after the sun went down, when decent folk were in their homes. They operated in the shadows, cleaning up the mess the city made during the day. They were called other names too. Nightmen, privy cleaners, rakers. The gong farmer is the one that sticks. It has that strange, almost noble ring to it, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the work. The job was a paradox. It was vital for the health of the city, yet it was performed by men who were considered unclean. They were paid well for their trouble, often more than a skilled craftsman, but the money came at a terrible price. The price was their health, their social standing, and sometimes their life. This was the world of the gong farmer. A world of darkness, filth, and quiet desperation. The night was the gong farmer's domain. He couldn't work when the sun was up. The rules were strict. The process of emptying a cesspit was so foul it had to be hidden by the darkness. Imagine a narrow, muddy street in medieval London. The houses lean in toward each other, blocking out the stars. There are no streetlights. The only light comes from a few shuttered windows, or the lantern carried by the gong farmer's crew. The crew was usually small, 2 or 3 men. There was the gong farmer himself, the master of the operation. He was the one who would go into the pit, and he had assistants, sometimes called tubmen. Their job was to stay above ground and manage the buckets. They would arrive with a small cart, pulled by a horse that was likely as miserable as the men. The cart carried their tools, a couple of large wooden buckets, sturdy ropes, a shovel, and a simple wooden ladder. They would find the house and meet the owner. The payment would be agreed upon. So much per ton of waste removed. Then the work would begin. The first step was to locate the cesspit. It was usually in a backyard or a cellar. The entrance was covered by a heavy stone slab or wooden planks. The tubman would pry it open. This was the moment the real horror began. The smell. It wasn't just a bad smell. It was an assault. A thick, choking cloud of stench that had been fermenting and building pressure for years. The air itself would feel heavy, thick with the gases of decomposition, methane, or hydrogen sulfide, ammonia. It was the smell of rot. of sickness, of death. Even for men who did this every night, it must have been a shock to the system. They would have to stand back for a moment, letting the worst of the fumes escape into the night air. Then the gong farmer prepared to go down. He would strip down to his trousers, the filth would ruin any clothes it touched, and it was better to have as little on as possible. The ladder was lowered into the pit. It would sink into the contents with a thick, sickening sound. The gong farmer would take the lantern and hang it nearby, though its light would do little to pierce the gloom of the pit. Then he would begin his descent. Climbing down into a cesspit was climbing down into hell. The darkness was absolute, the air was poison, and the floor was not solid. He would step off the ladder into a substance that was somewhere between a liquid and a solid. A thick, viscous sludge of human waste, rotting food scraps, and whatever else had been thrown down the privy for the last decade. It could be knee-deep, it could be chest-deep. He would sink into it, the cold, foul mass closing around his legs. His work began. He had one tool, a shovel. He would start scooping the filth into one of the wooden buckets. The work was physically exhausting. The sludge was heavy and dense. Each shovelful was a strain. When a bucket was full, he would shout up to his assistants. The tubmen would haul it up with a rope. Their hands would be raw from the friction. They would empty the bucket into a larger tub or barrel on the cart. Then they would lower the empty bucket back down. This process was repeated over and over for hours. Scoop, lift, shout. Haul, empty, lower. The only sounds were the scraping of the shovel, the creak of the rope, and the wet slap of the filth as it was dumped into the cart. The gong farmer worked in near total darkness, standing in a pool of human excrement. He was breathing in toxic fumes with every gasp of air. He couldn't see what he was shoveling. He could only feel the weight of it, smell the stench of it. Every minute in the pit was a risk. The fumes could overcome him. He might feel a wave of dizziness, a lightness in his head. His vision might start to tunnel. This was the sign that the air was running out of oxygen, replaced by poisonous gas. If he didn't get out immediately, he would pass out and fall face first into the sludge. He would suffocate. His own lantern was a danger. The methane gas was flammable. A stray spark could cause an explosion, a flash of flame in the confined space, and so he worked as fast as he could. The goal was to empty the pit before dawn. The work continued until his shovel hit the hard bottom of the pit. Only then could he climb out. He would emerge from the hole, a figure caked in filth, from the waist down. He was cold, exhausted, and reeking, but the job was not over. The crew had to transport the waste. They would lead their horse and cart through the dark, empty streets. They had to take the filth outside the city walls. This was also the law. They would dump it in designated fields or into a river, like the Thames. The river was already a sewer, but the gong farmer's cart added to the pollution. As the sun began to rise, their work was done. They would return home, trying to wash the filth and the smell from their skin, knowing they would have to do it all again the next night. The job was disgusting. It was dangerous. It was socially isolating, so why would anyone choose to be a gong farmer? The answer is simple: money. In a world where many people lived on the edge of starvation, gong farming paid surprisingly well. The principle of supply and demand was as true then as it is now. Nobody wanted to do this job. The demand for someone to empty the overflowing cesspits was high, but the supply of men willing to do it was very low. This drove the price up. A gong farmer could earn a significant amount of money in a single night. The records from the time show that a gong farmer in London might be paid 2 shillings for every ton of waste he removed. A skilled craftsman, like a carpenter or a mason, might only earn a few pence for a full day's work. A gong farmer could earn more in one night than that craftsman earned in a week. This income could change a man's life. It could mean the difference between living in a hovel and owning a small house. It could mean his children had enough to eat. For someone at the bottom of the social ladder with no skills and no prospects, becoming a gong farmer was a path out of poverty. It was a brutal, disgusting path, but it was a path nonetheless. Some gong farmers even became relatively wealthy. They could afford to hire their own assistants, buy more carts and horses, and run a full-fledged waste removal business. But this money came with a heavy social cost. Gong farmers were outcasts, they were untouchables. Their work made them permanently unclean in the eyes of society. People would literally hold their noses and cross the street to avoid them. The stench of their trade clung to them, to their clothes, to their homes. It was a smell that soap and water could not fully erase. It was a social stain. They were often forced to live in specific areas, usually on the outskirts of the city or downwind from the main population. No one wanted to be their neighbor. Their presence lowered the value of property and was a constant, smelly reminder of the city's dirty secret. Their families suffered too. A Gong farmer's wife and children would be shunned along with him. Their children would be bullied. They would find it hard to marry into clean families. The trade often became a family business out of necessity. A son would learn the trade from his father because there were few other opportunities available to him. The authorities kept a close watch on them. The work was so essential, but also so potentially disruptive that it had to be controlled. Laws were passed dictating when and where they could work. The rule about working only between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. was strictly enforced. If a Gong farmer was caught working during the day, he could be fined. The law also specified where they could dump the waste. It had to be taken to official dump sites outside the city or to certain points along the river. Dumping the waste illegally was a serious offense. A Gong farmer might be tempted to save time and effort by dumping his cartload of filth in a nearby alley or an unused field within the city. If caught, the punishment could be severe. He could be fined heavily. He could even be publicly shamed. In some cases, a Gong farmer caught illegally dumping was forced to stand in the pillory, a wooden frame that held his head and hands, while the public threw things at him. Sometimes they threw the very filth he had tried to dump. So the Gong farmer lived a life of contradictions. He had more money than many of his neighbors, but he had none of their respect. He performed a service that protected the health of the entire city, but he was treated as if he were a source of disease himself. He worked under a strict set of rules designed to keep his foul business hidden from the public eye. He was a necessary evil, a man who profited from the city's filth but paid for it with his dignity. Every shilling he earned was a reminder of the disgusting, dangerous work he had to do to get it. He was a man who was both better off and worse off than almost everyone around him. The pay was good, but every time a Gong farmer descended that ladder, he knew he might not come back up. The cesspit was a death trap. It was a place of hidden, silent killers. The greatest danger was not the filth itself, but the air. The decomposing waste in a cesspit released a cocktail of poisonous gases. The most dangerous were what they called foul air, or miasma. We now know this was a mix of methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and carbon monoxide. As these gases build up in the enclosed space, they push out the breathable oxygen. A Gong farmer climbing down into the pit was entering an environment where he could suffocate in minutes. The process was insidious. He might not notice anything at first, then he might feel a headache or a sense of dizziness. His lantern might start to flicker and dim. This was a critical warning sign. A flame needs oxygen to burn. If the lantern was going out, it meant the air was deadly, but the gases also affected the brain. They could cause confusion and disorientation. A man who was becoming dizzy might not have the clear-headedness to realize he needed to get out. He might try to keep working to finish the job. Then he would lose consciousness. He would slump over and fall into the thick sludge. Even if the fall didn't kill him, he would drown in the filth. Well, his assistants above might not even know what had happened until he stopped responding to their calls. There are historical records of these deaths. One of the most famous is the case of Richard the Raker. In 1326, in London, he was hired to empty a privy. He climbed down into the pit, was overcome by the foul air, and drowned in his client's excrement. His death was notable enough to be recorded, but he was surely not the only one. Countless unnamed Gong farmers must have met the same end, their deaths a grim footnote in the history of sanitation. Drowning was a constant threat, even without the gas. The consistency of the cesspit's contents was unpredictable. Sometimes it was a thick, almost solid mass. Other times, it could be a deep pool of liquid waste. A slip from a rotten ladder rung, a misstep in the dark, and a man could go under. Trying to swim in that thick, heavy sludge would be nearly impossible. Panic would set in. He would struggle, inhaling the filth, and die a terrifying death. Then there was the risk of structural collapse. Cesspits were not always built to last. The stone or brick lining could be poorly constructed. Over years, the constant damp and the pressure from the surrounding earth could weaken the walls. The weight and movement of the Gong farmer inside could be the final straw. The walls could cave in, burying him alive under tons of earth, stone, and his own foul harvest. It was a claustrophobic, horrific way to die. Even if a Gong farmer survived the night's work, the job was slowly killing him. He was in direct contact with a concentrated brew of human pathogens. Any small cut or scrape on his skin was an open invitation for a deadly infection. In an age without antibiotics, a simple infected cut could lead to sepsis and a painful death. The constant exposure to bacteria and viruses would have made him perpetually sick. Eye infections, skin diseases, and respiratory illnesses would have been common. He was breathing in atomized filth, which could lead to chronic lung problems. The life expectancy for a Gong farmer was likely much lower than the average, which was already grim in the medieval period. The job aged men quickly. The physical strain, the constant low-level sickness, and the psychological toll of working in such conditions would have worn down their bodies and their spirits. There was, however, one strange, small upside to the job. Sometimes, amidst all the filth, there was treasure. People accidentally dropped things down the privy all the time: coins, rings, silver spoons, small keys. A Gong farmer, sifting through the sludge with his shovel, might feel the hard clink of metal. Finding a silver coin would be a bonus for the night's work. Finding a gold ring could be life-changing. This small possibility of finding lost valuables was perhaps one of the few things that could make the descent into the pit a little less dreadful. But it was a small consolation. For every coin found, there were 1,000 nights of nothing but hard labor, stench, and the constant, looming presence of death. For centuries, the Gong farmer was a fixture of city life. His job was born of a simple, unavoidable problem people produce: waste, and it has to go somewhere. The cesspit was the solution, and the Gong farmer was the man who made that solution work. But nothing lasts forever. The era of the Gong farmer came to an end, not because people stopped needing him, but because technology made his job obsolete. The seeds of his demise were sown in the very cities he helped to maintain. As places like London and Paris grew larger and more crowded in the 18th and 19th centuries, the old system of cesspits began to break down completely. There were simply too many people, too much waste, and not enough space for the pits. The rivers, which had long served as the final dumping ground for the Gong farmers, became open sewers. The stench was no longer confined to a single backyard when a pit was opened. It became a permanent feature of the city. The turning point for London came in the summer of 1858. It was an unusually hot summer, and the low level of the River Thames, combined with the heat, created a perfect storm of filth. The river, thick with raw sewage, essentially began to cook in the sun. The result was a smell so powerful, so overwhelmingly awful, that it was given a name: the Great Stink. The stench paralyzed the city. It was so bad that the curtains in the Houses of Parliament had to be soaked in chloride of lime to mask the smell. Politicians could not debate. Court cases had to be abandoned. The theory at the time was that disease was spread by miasma, or foul air. Everyone, from the poorest slum dweller to the richest lord, believed this stench was literally deadly. They were wrong about the mechanism, but right about the danger. The contaminated river was the source of repeated cholera outbreaks that killed tens of thousands of people. The Great Stink forced the government to act. They could no longer ignore the problem. The solution was proposed by an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. His plan was revolutionary in its scale and ambition. He would build a massive underground network of sewers. These brick-lined tunnels would intercept the sewage before it reached the river and carry it far downstream, east of the city, where it would be released into the Thames on the outgoing tide. It was a monumental undertaking. It took years to build, employing thousands of workers. They built over 1,000 miles of sewers, a hidden underground river system that is still in use today. When the system was completed, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The Thames became cleaner. The cholera epidemic stopped, and the very reason for the Gong farmers' existence began to disappear. With the new sewers, houses could be connected directly to the system. The flush toilet, which had been invented earlier but was not practical for most people, became a viable option. Waste could now be whisked away with a pull of a chain. There was no longer a need for a cesspit in the backyard. And if there was no cesspit, there was no need for a man to empty it. The Gong farmers' trade did not vanish overnight. The transition took decades. Poorer neighborhoods and older houses were the last to be connected to the new sewer systems. The job evolved into that of the night soil man, who emptied newer types of privies and cesspools that weren't yet connected. But the core of the old job, the terrifying descent into the deep, dark, gas-filled pit, was over. The most dangerous and gruesome part of the profession faded into history. Today, the Gong farmer is a forgotten figure. He is a character from a darker, smellier past. We live in a world he could not have imagined, a world of sanitation and public health. We are shielded from the reality of our own waste, but his story is a powerful reminder of the hidden labor that keeps a society running. He did the job no one else would do, a job that was essential for the survival of the medieval city. He lived a life on the margins, surrounded by filth and danger, but he was a crucial part of the world he lived in. He was the man who worked in the dark, so that others could live in the light.